My 8-year-old daughter was in surgery, and the hospital told me I wasn't allowed to see her. Not because of hospital rules. Not because of a paperwork mistake. But because my own parents told the nurse. I wasn't immediate family. Let that sink in for a second. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine sitting in a hospital waiting room while your child is on an operating table. And suddenly someone tells the staff you're basically a stranger. What would you do? Would you scream? Argue? Demand answers? Or would you do what I did and stay completely quiet? Because sometimes the most powerful move you can make is saying nothing at all. But before I explain why I stayed quiet that night, you need to understand how we even ended up there. It started on a normal Tuesday morning. The kind of morning that feels so ordinary you don't even think twice about it. My daughter Maya was eating cereal at the kitchen table, drawing horses on the back of her math homework. She loved drawing horses. Always had. I remember she looked up at me and said, "Mom, when I grow up, I'm going to own a horse ranch." I laughed and told her she'd have to clean a lot of stalls first. She wrinkled her nose and said, "Okay, maybe just one horse." That was the last normal moment of the day. About 3 hours later, I got a call from her school. The nurse sounded calm. But that kind of calm that makes your stomach drop. "Maya's having severe stomach pain. We think you should come get her." When I arrived, she was curled up on the nurse's bed, pale and sweating. She tried to smile when she saw me, but I could tell something was wrong. Really wrong. Within 20 minutes, we were in an ambulance. The doctors suspected a ruptured appendix. If you've ever been in an ambulance with your child, you know how surreal it feels. Everything moves fast. Lights flashing. Machines beeping. Doctors asking questions faster than you can answer them. All you can think is one thing. Please be okay. At the hospital, things moved even faster. Doctors rushed Maya into emergency imaging. Nurses asked me questions. Medical history. Allergies. Insurance. Consent forms. I signed everything they put in front of me without hesitation. Because when your child needs surgery, there's no time to think about anything else. You just trust the doctors and hope they can fix whatever is wrong. About 30 minutes later, a surgeon came out and confirmed it. Her appendix had ruptured. They needed to operate immediately. I kissed Maya on the forehead before they wheeled her away. She grabbed my hand and whispered something that still echoes in my head. "Mom, don't leave." I promised her I wouldn't. And I meant it. So I sat in the waiting room outside the surgical wing. The room smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee. There was a clock ticking loudly on the wall. Every second felt like 10 minutes. Parents who have been through this know the feeling. You sit there staring at the doors your child disappeared through, hoping the next doctor who walks out brings good news. About 20 minutes into the wait, the sliding doors opened. And that's when my parents walked in. Robert Carter. My father. 61 years old. Tall, sharp suit, always looking like he just walked out of a boardroom. Behind him was my mother, Diane. Quiet. Observant. The kind of person who lets other people do the talking. Now here's the thing. We hadn't spoken much in almost 3 years. So seeing them walk into that hospital waiting room, at that exact moment, felt strange. Suspicious, even. My mother gave me a quick hug. My father barely acknowledged me. Instead, he walked straight to the nurse's desk. At first, I thought maybe he just wanted an update. You know, concerned grandparents. But then the nurse asked a simple question. "Who is the child's legal guardian?" I stood up immediately. "I am," I said. "I'm her mother." The nurse nodded and began typing into her computer. And that's when my father interrupted her. His voice was calm. Cold. Confident. "Actually," he said, "she's not immediate family." The nurse froze. She looked at him, then at me. My mother slowly nodded beside him. And just like that, the entire room went silent. The nurse turned back to her computer screen, clearly confused. "I'm sorry," she said carefully, "but if that's the case, we'll need to verify who has legal authority." Suddenly, I wasn't allowed past the surgical waiting area. Suddenly, I wasn't on the access list. Suddenly, I was just another person sitting in the waiting room, while my daughter was still inside the operating room. Everyone around us was watching. The tension in the room was thick enough to feel. And yet, I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't demand anything. I simply walked over to a chair and sat down. Quietly. My parents looked at each other like they had just won something. Like they'd planned this. And maybe they had. But here's what they didn't realize. I wasn't staying quiet because I was powerless. I was staying quiet because I already knew something they didn't. Minutes passed. Then half an hour. My parents whispered confidently to the nurse, acting like they were in control, like the situation belonged to them. But then the operating room doors opened, and the head surgeon walked out. Dr. Samuel Patel. He had a patient file in his hands. He looked around the room once. Then his eyes landed on my parents. And the moment he opened that file, my parents suddenly went completely silent. Because what was inside that folder was something they never expected anyone in that hospital to see. And what the doctor said next would expose everything. Why would parents try to erase their own daughter from a hospital room while her child is in surgery? That's the question everyone in that waiting room was silently asking. And honestly, if you had met my parents, you might have asked the same thing. Because on the surface, Robert and Diane Carter looked like the perfect family. My father built a very successful construction company. The kind of company with his name on trucks, billboards, and half the commercial buildings in our county. Growing up, people respected him, feared him, even. My mother was quieter. Always well-dressed, always polite. The kind of woman who smiled at charity events and never raised her voice in public. From the outside, we looked like the ideal family. But inside that house, things worked very differently. In our home, there was one rule above all others. Control. My father controlled everything. What we studied, who we spent time with, what choices were acceptable. And if you stepped outside those expectations, life got very uncomfortable very fast. My older brother Daniel understood that early. Daniel Carter, 35 now. The golden child. He did exactly what my father wanted. Business school. Joined the company. Wore the suits. Shook the hands. My father loved that. Daniel was the heir to the Carter name. The future of the business. And then there was me. Lena Carter. The problem child. At least according to my father. I asked questions. I pushed back. When my father told me to study business in college, I told him I wanted to study art. He laughed. Not because it was funny. Because he thought I'd change my mind once I grew up. I didn't. That was the first real fracture between us. But the moment that shattered everything happened years later. I was 23. And pregnant. When I told my parents, the reaction was immediate. My father didn't yell. He didn't need to. He just sat at the dining table staring at me like I had just destroyed something valuable. This will ruin the family's reputation, he said. Those were his exact words. Not, are you okay? Not, what do you need? Just reputation. My mother didn't say much. She simply folded her hands and asked one question. Are you keeping it? I said yes. Without hesitation. That answer changed everything. My father stood up slowly and walked to the window. Then he gave me the ultimatum. I remember every word. You can stay in this house, he said, if you do things the right way. By the right way, he meant giving the baby up for adoption. Or letting them raise her under their control. But I wasn't about to hand over my child like a business transaction. So I chose the other option. I left. One suitcase. One small apartment. And a future that terrified me. Because raising a child alone at 23 isn't exactly easy. But the moment Maya was born, I knew I made the right choice. She had these tiny little hands that wrapped around my finger like she already trusted me completely. And from that day forward, it was always the two of us. Did we struggle? Absolutely. There were months where I worked 2 jobs just to cover rent and daycare. I became a dental assistant first. Then eventually trained to become a dental hygienist. Slowly, life stabilized. Nothing fancy, but stable. And Maya grew up happy. She loved drawing horses, riding her bike, and asking a million questions about the world. My parents stayed mostly distant during those years. Occasional birthday cards, the occasional holiday phone call, but no real relationship. Honestly, I preferred it that way. Until about 6 months ago. That's when something strange happened. My father called me out of the blue. And if you know my father, that alone was unusual. He asked if we could have dinner. Just family. No arguments. No tension. At least that's what he promised. So against my better judgment, I agreed. Dinner that night felt almost normal. My father asked Maya about school. My mother brought gifts. Daniel even showed up and joked around like we were some big happy family again. But something about the whole thing felt off. Too friendly. Too rehearsed. My father kept asking questions about Maya. Her school. Her activities. Her future. At one point, he even asked if I had updated her legal documents. That question stuck in my head. Because my father never cared about things like that before. Then a few weeks later, my mother called again. She asked if she could get a copy of Maya's birth certificate. For family records, she said. That's when my instincts kicked in. I told her no. Her voice immediately changed. The sweetness disappeared. And the call ended quickly. Looking back now, that moment should have warned me what was coming. Because weeks later, my parents walked into that hospital waiting room acting far too confident. Like they had already won something. And when my father told the nurse I wasn't immediate family, he didn't sound nervous. He sounded prepared. Which raises a disturbing question. How could he be so sure the hospital would believe him? The answer came a few minutes later, when the surgeon walked out holding that file, and asked my parents one simple question. Which one of you filed the emergency custody claim this morning? The entire waiting room went silent. Because in that moment, I realized something terrifying. My parents didn't just lie to a nurse. They had tried to legally take my daughter. And they had done it while she was lying unconscious on an operating table. But what shocked me even more was how confident they still looked. Like they believed this plan was going to work. What they didn't realize was that the file in Dr. Patel's hands contained something that was about to destroy their entire plan. And when he opened it, everything changed. What kind of people try to take custody of a child while she's in surgery? That question hung in the air the moment Dr. Patel asked it. Which one of you filed the emergency custody claim this morning? The waiting room went completely still. Even the clock on the wall suddenly felt louder. Tick, tick, tick. My father's confident posture stiffened slightly. Just a small shift in his shoulders. But I noticed. Because I've spent my entire life reading that man. He glanced at my mother for half a second. Then he stepped forward. I did, he said calmly. Not embarrassed. Not nervous. Almost proud. Like he believed he had just done the responsible thing. The nurse behind the desk looked confused. Custody claim, she asked. Dr. Patel nodded and lifted the file slightly. Yes. The hospital received a notice from the county clerk's office about 20 minutes ago. 20 minutes. Think about that. My daughter had been in surgery for about 40 minutes. Which means my father filed that paperwork almost immediately after arriving at the hospital. Coincidence? Not a chance. This was planned. My father clasped his hands behind his back like he was presenting a business case. Doctor, we're simply trying to protect our granddaughter. Protect. That word almost made me laugh. But I stayed silent. Remember earlier when I said I didn't argue? This is why. Because when people think they're winning, they reveal everything. Dr. Patel flipped open the file. Calm. Professional. Mr. Carter, he said, an emergency guardianship filing does not immediately transfer legal authority. My father didn't seem concerned. That may be true, he replied, but given the circumstances, we believe the hospital should be cautious. Cautious. What he meant was, keep Lena away. My mother finally spoke. Her voice soft. Fragile. She's been struggling, Diane said quietly, gesturing toward me. Struggling? That was new. Dr. Patel looked up slowly. Struggling with what? My mother sighed like this was painful for her. With responsibilities, she said. And, just like that, The performance began. If you've ever seen someone manipulate a situation, you know exactly what this looked like. Gentle tone. Concerned expression. Carefully chosen words. She's always been independent, my mother continued. Sometimes too independent. The nurse shifted uncomfortably. My father added, our granddaughter deserves stability. Now here's the thing. They weren't yelling. They weren't accusing me directly. They were doing something far more dangerous. Planting doubt. And hospitals take that seriously. Because when a child is involved, staff have to consider every possibility. Dr. Patel listened quietly. Then he asked a very simple question. One moment, he said, flipping another page in the file. Who signed the surgical consent form? The nurse leaned over the desk and checked the computer. Her finger traced across the screen. Then she looked up. Lena Carter signed it, she said. My father's jaw tightened. Just slightly. Dr. Patel nodded. Which means she was recognized as the child's legal guardian upon admission. My father cleared his throat. That's before the hospital knew about the custody filing. The room went quiet again. Now everyone was waiting for the doctor's response. And Dr. Patel did something interesting. He didn't argue. He simply continued reading. Page after page. Calm. Methodical. Almost like he was looking for something specific. And then he stopped. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough that I knew he had found it. He pulled a sheet of paper from the back of the file. Interesting, he murmured. My father shifted his weight. What is it? Dr. Patel held up the document. A legal affidavit. My father frowned. Affidavit. The doctor nodded. This document was filed 3 years ago. Now my parents looked confused. Because they had no idea what he was talking about. But I did. 3 years earlier. Right after a massive argument with my father. I had a feeling something like this might happen someday. Call it intuition. Call it survival. But I went to a lawyer. And that lawyer gave me a piece of advice I will never forget. He said, when powerful families feel like they're losing control, they sometimes try to regain it through legal pressure. So we prepared for that. The document Dr. Patel was holding was called a Parental Rights Protection Affidavit. It clearly stated something very specific. Robert and Diane Carter had no guardianship authority over my daughter. None. And more importantly, it warned institutions like hospitals and schools that any attempt by them to claim authority should be verified legally. Dr. Patel looked directly at my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, he said calmly, this affidavit specifically prevents you from interfering with the child's guardianship. For the first time since they arrived, my parents looked rattled. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just quiet. My father opened his mouth to respond. But no words came out. Dr. Patel closed the file. Then he turned toward me. Miss Carter, he said, your daughter is waking up from surgery. My heart jumped into my throat. But before I could even stand up, 2 large men in dark uniforms walked into the waiting room. Hospital security. They approached my parents. And suddenly, the confident expressions on their faces disappeared. Because those guards weren't there to escort me. They were there for Robert and Diane Carter. And the next question security asked them would expose the real reason they tried to take my daughter. Have you ever watched someone realize their plan just collapsed? Not slowly. Not gradually. But all at once? That's exactly what happened in the hospital waiting room when security walked in. 2 officers. Calm. Professional. But their presence changed the entire atmosphere instantly. You could feel it. The tension. The shift in power. A moment earlier, my parents had been standing tall like they controlled the entire situation. Now, they suddenly looked smaller. One of the officers stepped forward. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, he asked. My father straightened his jacket immediately. That old instinct kicked in. The one where he tries to dominate every room he walks into. Yes, he said firmly. The officer nodded toward the nurse's desk. We need to speak with you about a report regarding misrepresentation of guardianship. Misrepresentation. That's a very polite way of saying something serious. The nurse, Emily, was standing nearby, clutching the file Dr. Patel had handed her earlier. If you remember, she was the one who looked confused when my father first claimed I was an immediate family. Now she looked different. More certain. More alert. Because once the affidavit appeared in the file, the situation changed completely. And hospitals take legal liability very seriously. Dr. Patel spoke calmly. Mr. Carter informed hospital staff that Ms. Carter was not immediate family to the patient. The officer nodded. And according to the documents you've reviewed, that statement was false? Dr. Patel didn't hesitate. Yes, the word landed hard. False. My father's jaw tightened again. He tried to recover quickly. That's a misunderstanding, he said. We simply filed for emergency guardianship. But the officer shook his head slightly. Filing a request is not the same as having legal authority. Exactly. And that's the part my father had gambled on. He assumed the paperwork alone would confuse hospital staff long enough for him to step in, control the situation, push me out. But that plan collapsed the moment Dr. Patel found that affidavit. The officer turned to my mother. Ma'am, were you aware of the affidavit filed 3 years ago? My mother blinked. No, she said quietly. And for the first time since they arrived, she looked genuinely nervous. Because without that document, their story might have worked. But with it, everything they said now looked suspicious. The officer looked back at my father. Sir, can you explain why you told hospital staff the child's mother was not immediate family? The waiting room had gone silent again. Even the other families sitting nearby were listening. My father hesitated. Just for a moment. Then he gave the answer I expected. We were concerned about our granddaughter's well-being. Concerned. There was that word again. But this time, no one seemed convinced. Dr. Patel crossed his arms. If you were concerned, he said evenly, why did you attempt to block the legal guardian from accessing the surgical wing? That question hung in the air. My father didn't answer immediately. And that silence? It was louder than anything he could have said. The officer spoke again. Mr. Carter, we also received a timeline from hospital staff. He glanced down at a small notebook. The emergency guardianship petition was filed at 2:14 p.m. The nurse nodded. That's correct. The officer continued. And the patient entered surgery at 2:09 p.m. 5 minutes. That's all it took. 5 minutes after Maya was wheeled into surgery. My father filed paperwork trying to claim control over her. Think about that for a second. While she was unconscious on an operating table, my parents were at the courthouse trying to take custody. The realization spread across the room. You could see it on people's faces. Confusion, disbelief, and slowly, anger. The officer closed his notebook. Sir, filing legal petitions during a medical emergency while misrepresenting your authority raises serious concerns. My father's voice sharpened. I did nothing illegal. Maybe, technically, but ethically? That was a different conversation. And then something unexpected happened. Nurse Emily spoke up. She had been quiet most of the time, observing, listening, but now she stepped forward. There's something else, she said. Everyone looked at her. She turned toward the officer. When the patient briefly woke up before surgery, she asked for her mom. Simple, but powerful. Emily continued. She didn't ask for her grandparents. She asked for Lena. The room went silent again. Because in that moment, the entire narrative my parents were trying to build collapsed. My father opened his mouth to argue again. But the officer raised his hand slightly. That's enough for now. Then he gestured toward the hallway. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, we're going to ask you to step outside while we sort this out. My mother looked stunned. My father looked furious. But neither of them moved at first. Until the officer repeated himself. More firmly this time. And slowly, reluctantly, they walked toward the exit. As they passed me, my father stopped. For a brief second, we locked eyes. I expected anger. Instead, I saw something else. Calculation. Like his mind was already working on the next move. But before he could say a single word, Dr. Patel turned toward me. Miss Carter, he said gently. Your daughter is awake. Every emotion I had been holding back all afternoon hit me at once. Relief, fear, love. I stood up quickly. But just as I started walking toward the recovery hallway, the officer called after me. "Miss Carter." I turned. "There's one more thing you should know," he said. And what he said next made my stomach drop, because it explained the real reason my parents had tried to take Maya that day. And it had nothing to do with concern. It had everything to do with money. Why would grandparents try to take custody of their granddaughter in the middle of a medical emergency? That was the question still hanging in my mind when the officer stopped me in the hallway. "Miss Carter." I turned back toward him. "There's one more thing you should know," he said. And the way he said it made my stomach tighten, because his tone wasn't curious. It was certain. He glanced down at his notes briefly, then back at me. "Your parents mentioned something during our conversation outside." My heart was already racing. Maya had just woken up from surgery. My entire focus was supposed to be on getting to her room. But whatever he was about to say clearly mattered. "What did they say?" I asked. The officer hesitated for a second. Then he said it. "They brought up your daughter's trust fund." For a moment, I didn't respond, because that wasn't a detail many people knew about. And suddenly a dozen strange conversations from the past 6 months started replaying in my head. My father asking unusual questions about Maya's future. My mother requesting copies of documents. The sudden family dinners. The sudden interest. It all clicked at once. You see, Maya's father passed away when she was only 2 years old. Before that happened, he had quietly set up a small trust fund in her name. Nothing extravagant, but enough to help her with college someday. And according to the legal structure of that trust, I was the sole guardian managing it until Maya turned 18, which meant one thing. If someone else gained legal guardianship of Maya, they would gain control over that trust. The officer watched my reaction carefully. "They seemed very aware of it," he said. Aware. That was putting it lightly. My father had built his entire life around money and control. And recently, things hadn't been going well for him. About 4 months earlier, rumors started spreading about lawsuits involving his construction company. Contract disputes. Safety violations. Projects falling apart financially. I didn't pay much attention to it at the time, but now the pieces were starting to connect. If his company was struggling, if his finances were tightening, then Maya's trust fund might have looked like an opportunity, not a granddaughter, an asset. And that realization hit harder than anything else that happened that day, because it meant the hospital incident wasn't just manipulation. It was strategy, a calculated move. But right now, none of that mattered more than one thing. My daughter. Dr. Patel was already holding the door open for me. "She's been asking for you," he said gently. I nodded and walked down the recovery hallway. Hospitals have a strange kind of quiet in those areas. Machines humming. Nurses moving softly between rooms. Everything controlled. Precise. Room 214. That's where Maya was. When I stepped inside, she looked so small in the hospital bed. Tubes. Monitors. A blanket pulled up to her chest. Her eyes opened slowly when she heard me walk in. "Mom?" That one word. After everything that happened in that waiting room. After hearing my parents try to convince people I wasn't immediate family. That word meant everything. I walked over and took her hand. "I'm here," I said. Her fingers squeezed mine weakly. "I was scared," she whispered. "I know," I told her. "But you were really brave." Dr. Patel explained that the surgery had gone well. The appendix had ruptured, but they were able to clean the infection and stabilize everything. She would need a few days in the hospital, but she was going to recover. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not my parents. Not their plan. Not their lies. Just Maya breathing safely in that hospital bed. Later that evening, Nurse Emily stopped by the room. She smiled when she saw Maya awake and talking. Then she looked at me. "Just so you know," she said quietly, "security escorted your parents out of the building." I wasn't surprised, but hearing it still felt like the closing of a chapter. For years, my father had controlled every room he entered, every conversation, every situation. But in that hospital waiting room, For the first time in my life. He didn't. And the reason was simple. Truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs the right moment. Over the next few weeks, the legal situation played out exactly how you might expect. The emergency guardianship request my father filed was reviewed in court. The judge looked at the timeline, the affidavit, the hospital incident, and the ruling came quickly. Full custody remained with me. My parents were given absolutely no legal authority over Maya. None. And the judge made something very clear. Any further attempts to interfere could result in legal restrictions. After that day, my parents stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped trying. And honestly, the silence felt peaceful. Maya recovered quickly. Within a few weeks, she was back home, filling our kitchen table with drawings of horses again. Like nothing had happened. Kids are amazing that way. They bounce back. But every once in a while, I still think about that moment in the waiting room. When my father told the nurse I wasn't immediate family. Because technically, he tried to erase me with just one sentence. But reality works differently. When Maya woke up from surgery, the first thing she asked was simple. Where's my mom? Not grandparents. Not anyone else. Just mom. And sometimes, that's all the proof you need.